Hello and welcome to People and Places, the new series from the AIDEM. Of course, people and places matter in everybody's lives. All of us remember people. All of us remember places. There are special people, special places, which kind of guide and control our lives. It may have happened many decades ago, but one incident or a personality will continue to influence us. And to start this program, I have a very special person, Balagopal Chandrashekar, a man who has literally worn very many hats. He was a bureaucrat, he was an entrepreneur, failed entrepreneur to start with, then a successful entrepreneur, a man who's kind of handheld many startups. Then he was also till recently the chairman of the Federal Bank. In his first book, where he recounts his experience as a bureaucrat, the book titled On a Clear Day, You Can See India, he says like this: faces and sights and landscapes and smells and sounds and tastes from a long time ago floated up each memory as each memory was recalled. So, people and places have always been part of your life. Welcome to this program. The special context in which we are looking at people and places, because your career as a bureaucrat began in Manipur, which of course is now a major focus area. I can even say it's in the eye of the storm. So, of course, you worked there in the 1980s, and of course, you've been in touch with that region for a very long time. Can you tell us something about Manipur then and Manipur now?
Thank you, Venkatesh, for that nice introduction. Manipur, when I worked, which was in the late 70s and early 80s, and Manipur today are, I find, very different places. The state, of course, has grown a bit in population from about around little more than 2 million population those days. Now it is around 3 million. Of course, administratively it has grown, because in those days we had only 4 districts, and now I think there are 16 districts there. So this administrative inflation is happening in many parts of the country.
It's all over the country. In fact, you mentioned that in the book itself. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, but one major difference is while insurgency and political disaffection was fairly strong even then, the problem was seen to be a political problem and was being tackled at the political level those days, with the armed forces not in the scene at all, and even troubled areas where there was need to impose curfew, those were patrolled by BSF and CRPF, which are the paramilitary forces. There was one army brigade in a place called Limakong outside Imphal, but they were always in the barracks. They were never seen outside.
Okay.
And the only other paramilitary formation which was evident by the various camps which they had were the Assam Rifles. The Assam Rifles were a paramilitary formation with the officers drawn from the army. So they also wore uniforms which looked like the army, but they were strictly speaking not army. So why I am saying this at length is that the clear approach was seen to be a political approach, and there were channels through which talks were going on regularly with the Naga insurgents and the Manipuri insurgency groups also. Then it was in the mid-80s to late 80s, by which time I had already left the service, having decided to become an entrepreneur. It was around that time that a sudden decision seems to have been taken in Delhi, especially North Block, where the Home Ministry is located, to beef up the military presence in Manipur. And what was previously a token army presence in a border state in the form of a brigade at Lamakong was replaced by a full mountain division, which moved in. And in fact, I remember one of my service friends humorously writing to me saying the vehicle population of Manipur had doubled after the mountain division moved in, because the mountain division has so many vehicles, trucks and others, apart from armored personnel carriers and artillery units and things like that. So that seemed to me to be, even at that time, I felt it
You're
was...
talking about the mid-1980s or?
Yeah, in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
Mid to late 1980s. So even at that time, I remember feeling that this was excessive military military force for what was even, in terms of sheer numbers, what were always seen to be a few hundred members of the various insurgency groups, never totaling more than 1,000. So obviously this was based on some very alarming picture of the scene in Manipur.
Yeah, but now what was the reason for that kind of a depiction or kind of an understanding like that? Because as you said, that as somebody who's been many bureaucrats, many police personnel and many security specialists who must have said that not more than 1,000 people are there. I mean,
so that's a very good question, Venkatesh, because even when I was working there as a young SDO in Ukhrul and then later in Imphal, we used to feel that when we saw in mainland newspapers and when we used to read the news coming out, we used to wonder on what basis are they writing this kind of pretty alarming information, because we who were on the spot didn't feel the situation warranted that kind of alarmist picture. So I think a combination of some half truths which were going down from anecdotal sources, plus huge ignorance on the part of the senior people sitting in the Home Ministry, many of whom had probably never been to the Northeast and to Manipur themselves. Their perceptions were formed on the basis of this incorrect and information and half-truths which were circulating. Even in those days, we used to say, in those days also, that many of the correspondents never came to Imphal. They used to sit in Guwahati or Calcutta and file their stories. And today, I believe that's particularly true, that very few people are going to Imphal to really go into the troubled areas and to fight.
It's not just Imphal. I think going to the hills where the cookies are in majority, that's physically impossible. Only a handful of journalists must have gone. In fact, your book was written way back, but then you have mentioned very clearly, while serious students of the affairs of the Northeast have started to move in this direction, mainstream national media and consequently mainstream public opinion appears to be still be mired in the cliches and images of the past. You think still?
I think that still continues, and so there is the ignorance about the Northeast is displayed very sometimes almost semi-comically by exaggerating incidents which happened there, but more sadly by the indifference to what is really happening there. Because there are problems there which are not getting really noticed. I think, for example, today, if you see in the media, there is a very dangerous tendency to project what is happening in Manipur as a religious kind of conflict between Hindus and Christians. In my opinion, that is so far off the mark. That is completely missing the point. I believe that it is more an ethnic problem, and it is more a traditional problem between the valley and the hills. And the valley was always represented by the Meiteis, who were the settled civilization there, whereas the hill people were either Nagas, Kukis, Mizos, etc. And that was more of a unsettled that is shifting cultivation. And some people were, and there was constant movement of populations across international borders, because this whole area, it is spilt over into northern parts of Burma, Myanmar. So that's one. But the real root of the problem, in my opinion, and actually this is not based on my study because I don't have that much scholarly knowledge of the Northeast, but I rely on the information of an outstanding journalist, Manipuri, who lives in Imphal. His name is Pradeep Fanjaubam. Pradeep Fanjaubam has written what, in my opinion, are some of the magisterial works on the Northeast. And one of them actually contains the seeds of the problem, where he talks about the inner line. And the inner line regulation, which was imposed by the British towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in my opinion, that is what really has laid the foundation for this apparently unsolvable ethnic dispute between the hills and the valley. So just to explain what that inner line is, when the British moved in to Manipur, they moved into Manipur to expel on the side of the Manipuri king, to expel the Arakan kings who had...
Right.
The Manipuri king and the Arakan kings used to constantly be at war. And so the Manipuri kings used to also have battles with the Ahom kings. So they all...
It's a constant state of...
It's a constant state of conflict. So the British intervened on the side of the Manipuri king, and they defeated the Arakan king. And then they now established their British suzerainty over this area. But they never really occupied it like the rest of colonial India. Instead, they placed a resident there, and they moved out. They moved back. The troops and all that moved out. But the message which was sent to the Arakan kings was, now this is the British protectorate, under British protection. Now, as the British had adopted a policy in Assam, which was in the valley and settled agricultural areas, the land revenue laws and all the statutes of the British administration extended to those settled areas. In the hill areas which were occupied by tribes, whether it is the Mishmis of Arunachal or the Nagas or the Kukis or the Mizos, all of them, what they did was they drew a line along the foothills where the valley meets the mountains. I mean, where the flatland meets the mountains. And that was called the inner line. And towards the hillside or the mountains side of the inner line, the land revenue regulations did not apply. And the hill people were warned not to step on this side and to try any trouble, because that would bring down the wrath of the British colonial power on them. Now, this was extended to Manipur. Now, in Manipur, as Pradeep Fanjaubam writes, there is an intimate relationship, not just in Manipur, in geography across the world. Hills can never be separated from valleys. The valley is meaningless without the hills, and the hills are meaningless without the valleys. So there was a constant movement between these two. The British putting this inner line confined the hill people to the hills, but more cruelly confined the valley people to the valley. Why I say more cruelly is, one of the facts about Manipur is 90% of the surface area of Manipur is mountainous, and only 10% is valley. Whereas 60% of the population of Manipur is Meitei, who are the people who live predominantly in the valley, and only 40% are the various tribes. So 60% of the population got confined, restricted by law to 10% of the land. And there, I believe, starts an enormous sense of grievance but
there is also the point that in terms of political power equations, because of the advantage of population, the Meiteis have had especially in recent years, have had a bigger share of political power, whereas even though the hill people, they had more land and other resources, but then they were not having the same kind of share. And also coupled with the fact, I think Manipur must be the only state where an aggressive forced or aggressive Hindu proselytization took place from the indigenous communities. So when you say that this is not exactly a Hindu-Christian problem, but there are dimensions which are kind of, contiguous with it. Don't you think so?
Yeah, but again, I think, see, that is purely because that is coincidental, meaning the problem is between the valley and the hills. So the valley people are Meiteis and the hill people are the Kukis and Nagas. And therefore, now it so happens that overwhelming percentage of the valley people few years ago were Hindus, and the overwhelming percentage of the proportion of the hill people were Christian. So that is purely a coincidental, but religion was never the trigger for religious, even there were hardly any slogans or anything.
It was not the primary parameter.
It was not the primary parameter. So that was one. The other point is, you're right about the fact that because of democratic processes where first past the post majority gets you, that community or that faction which has the numbers will naturally roll. The same thing is happening in reverse in Nagaland and Mizoram and Assam and various other places, where whichever ethnic group is in majority, its diktat will run across the state. In the valley, in Manipur, therefore, one shouldn't be surprised that once democracy came there and the elections started to be held, the numerical superiority of the Meiteis would reflect in political power. But notwithstanding that, I don't think, there was a lot of an interchange and exchange of people and movement between the hill and the valley till the inner line regulation came to be enforced.
Right.
And the inner line regulation also meant that had a cruel way, a one-sidedness to it. And that was, the Meiteis could not own land in the hills, but the reverse did not hold true.
Right.
So the hill people could come and own land and property and all in the valley. So that was a second source of grievance and bitterness among the Meiteis, which was growing. And the third source was the Meiteis, for various reasons, rejected scheduled tribe status. And which meant that the hill people got scheduled tribe status, which meant they got preferential appointment to the central services, and also in terms of income tax and various other things. Whereas those facilities were denied to the people in the valley. So initially it was a matter of pride, but later on it turned out to be a double-edged, counterproductive kind of thing.
So basically, I think I remember reading in your book that that as part of the proselytization, the Meiteis also kind of assimilated and imbibed the Chaturvarnya system with all the caste hierarchy and all that.
Everything.
So that must have been the reason for them to deny the.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it was a sense of superiority, but not only that was, I would ascribe it not only to the Hindu Chaturvarna system, but also because of the fact that they were the rulers. In that whole mountainous belt, the only place which had a standing army, because to have a standing army, you need settled agriculture. And the only place which had settled agriculture was the Manipur Valley.
Right.
And the valley was very fertile, and it had a settled, so it could support a standing army. And this army they were extremely capable fighters. And that's why they could, on even terms, they could take on the much bigger and much more powerful Arakan kings and the Ahom kings, who generally stayed away from trying to subjugate this troublesome kingdom area called Manipur. So, to come back to the other thing, so therefore, the sense of Meitei grievance was growing. Now, during this time, the Naga and the hill people in the hill areas of Manipur were having their own problems with the Indian Union in the form of insurgency movements and independence struggles and also autonomy issues and all that. So they were fighting a separate kind of battle. But this grievance which was mounting in the Meiteis, I feel, has passed unnoticed and unattended to. Nobody gave it any weightage. And what has been this is something like it just needed something to let the genie out of the bottle. And unfortunately, what has happened is this very poorly timed, ill-advised judgment by a High Court judge of Manipur, of the Manipur High Court, who chose to entertain a petition and pass such a, extraordinary order, which has now been set aside by the Supreme Court. The damage is already done.
Yeah, absolutely sensational.
Absolutely. So that what happened was, and the opposition to that seems to have triggered off the very ferocious response from the Manipuris, because the Manipuris felt whatever the judge had ordered, that all those benefits should be extended to Meiteis also. Scheduled tribe and scheduled caste benefits should be extended to Meiteis.
There is also a counter reaction to that, basically, because it is not in there.
So when the Kukis protested against that, the Meiteis...
and also perhaps there's also some kind of political prodding from some sections of...
Oh yes, I wouldn't put it beyond the main political formations in India to try and, because and stir the pot and create some more problem.
Yeah.
The problem when you're dealing with things like this, as Pradeep Panjobam says, you're dealing with the deep-seated sense of grievance and injury, which cannot be just papered over.
Yeah.
And so now we have a real situation. We have a real problem.
Now, there is a strain of opinion, especially among the armed forces and senior officers who some of those people have even served in the Northeast and in Manipur, who say that, that perhaps the biggest mistake that was done by the powers that be or the government is the withdrawal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. What is your take on that?
I am of the view that and I've written about that in my book also, that the decision to send the army in is a political decision, which is taken to send the army in. And the problem is, once the army goes in, we forget that the army is not a police force. The army, the soldiers there and their officers and their sole mission is to defend the country against external aggression and internal threats which are so serious that the police and all cannot handle it, and it threatens the integrity of the country. Then in an extreme situation, you send the army. Now, I am not authority on the laws. I've forgotten many of the what we were trained in the academy about this extraordinary situation called martial law. But what I remember is the army was, strictly speaking, to be used only in that extraordinary situation where martial law is declared. In such a situation, the rules are apparently that the situation has gone out of control of the civilian administration. Therefore, martial law is declared, and the situation is handed over to the army to restore calm and quiet, restore order, and hand it back to the civilian authority. Now, instead of doing that, which, if that was contemplated by the law, that is what should have been done. The situation, if it really merited that, should have been handed over to the army. And I'm sure no civilian administrator would say that ever has a situation arisen where the civilian administration, with the use of paramilitary forces, could not control any situation in any part of India. So you will never hear of the army having to be called out anywhere to other than a flag march or something, but they're never used anywhere.
Yes. Why, especially to engage with the civilians.
Especially to engage with the civilians. So now, because of the civilian administration not doing that, what has happened is I think both the army officers commanding those units, as well as the civilian administrators and the politicians who took the decision to send the army in, were unclear about, has the situation been handed over to the army? If it is handed over to the army, then the army, if you take a hypothetical situation of, say, a district magistrate going to a army unit commander in such a conflict situation and saying, do this, do that, the army guy will probably just have to tell, under martial law, will have to tell the civilian administration, you guys have no role here because it's martial law and the situation has been handed over to us. We will restore calm in our own way and we'll hand it back to you. There can be no ways that you have to do it according to this rule and that rule and all that. So I think this ambiguity is what has created the problem. And therefore, it was felt necessary to have an Armed Forces Special Powers Act to protect army officers army personnel who are operating under the in such situations. I think that is not a good solution at all. And I think the old regulations where you had a situation of either the situation is under management by the civilian administration or civilian administration is deemed to have collapsed and the situation is handed over to the army and martial law declared. So then there is no ambiguity and the situation would have. So my answer to your question is, I think the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is unnecessary because and then in such ambiguous situations, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act can lead to all kinds of troublesome situations, legal and political.
So the long and short of it is that, that you are saying that the situation now is actually a situation where it is of extreme concern. But you yourself said when you were there was only one brigade and it was not actually, and also you made it very clear the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was not required for a state like Manipur. But now there is a situation. So how do you think this can be handled?
I still think it is a political problem and has to be handled politically. And the most important thing which is necessary is that people must start talking. And I see no evidence of any talking going on between the contending parties. Because all that we hear here are some, very bad reports of terrible incidents which happened some time back, a few months ago, are slowly coming out.
Yeah.
And so people are not, who read the news don't realize this happened on 3rd of May or 4th of May. It's not that it happened yesterday. Yeah. Of course, it's still bad. Of course, the perpetrators must be brought to book. But the impression when you read the media is this as if this just happened. So the way it is presented is also wrong. There is no clarity. So people are under the impression there is a continuing kind of insurrection.
But that is happening. We are getting reports of people getting killed on a day-to-day basis.
So, no, I'm not, since I really don't know too much about other than what I'm reading in the media, what we know is what has happened. One of the things which has apparently happened is that there has been a kind of ethnic cleansing which has happened in the valley and in the Kuki-dominated hill areas of southeastern Manipur. All the Meiteis from the southeastern hill areas have either returned to the valley or are in camps protected by the army. And similarly, the Kukis in the valley, which are the predominantly Meitei areas, are in camps or have returned to their hometowns. So, which means that is a very bad sign because it means that there is now no
dialogue,
contact, no dialogue, no interaction. And people are just sitting there bitter about the loss of their near and dear ones, loss of their property, loss of their jobs. And this will only fan and keep the bitterness very strong. So I think the first step which is needed is there must be very highest level intervention from the Prime Minister. People like that must all be in Manipur, get people to sit across it. Because when prestigious people like the PM and all go there, then everybody will come to the table.
Yeah.
So here, if it is left to a chief minister who is seen as discredited, and if you expect him to solve the problem, he's not going to be able to solve the problem because the people on both sides of the divide see him as part of the problem. So I think the thing is, number one, the conversations are not starting. Number two, there are interlocutors who should be pressed into service. There are people who are really knowledgeable about what has happened in, what is the situation in Manipur and in the whole Northeast. I can take one name is, for instance, the former Home Secretary G.K. Pillai. G.K. Pillai is one of those guys who was not only very knowledgeable about the Northeast, but he was highly respected because he was seen as fair and even-handed by the Nagas, by the Mizos, by the Kukis, by the Meiteis and all. So Assamese and Bodos, and everybody accepted him. Now, there are very few figures like him today.
Okay.
Now, he is a long retired, and I know he's still very active in certain circles in Delhi.
We should discuss your association with G.K. Pillai in one of the episodes of People and Places, because he also calls him to...
Sure.
We will discuss that. Yeah, but I would like to end because, we also are short on time. See, your title, the title of the book is very, very interesting. On a clear day, you can see India. And then you depict that in in one of the chapters of the book, where your first DC, who we have named him as RN, he takes you out on a field trip, and then he shows you the east, west, south, and north. And he says, and then he has got a van in his hand, and he shows it and says, that this side is, on a clear day, you can see India. So what do you exactly mean by that? Such an enigmatic expression.
This particular DC was a very wry, laconic kind of individual. He had a very wry, dry sense of humor. So, I think what he was saying when he pointed towards the west and said, on a clear day, you can see India, what he was referring to was not only the physical distance. See, people don't realize how far away Manipur is. I remember when I was preparing my first TA bill to go and join there at Imphal, I discovered that by rail, the distance was 3,400 and odd kilometers. Now, can you imagine, you're still in the same country and you're 3,400 kilometers you're traveling from your hometown to reach this place. But more than
half of Europe.
Yeah, exactly. And more than the physical distance was the fact that we have one time zone in India, which is actually quite absurd, because in Manipur, I remember 4 o'clock, after 4 o'clock Indian Standard Time, when we look at a watch, it's 4 o'clock. The first few weeks and months, it took us great difficulty to get adjust, because outside it was dusk. The sun had already set. And it's still 4 o'clock.
Right.
And 4:30 in the morning, it is only 4:30 in the morning, but the sun has already risen, because that far east it is.
Right.
In fact, many people don't realize that the line of longitude which passes through some parts of Arunachal Pradesh is the same line of longitude which passes through Thailand.
Right.
So there are parts of India which are so far east that they're as far east as Thailand is from India.
Yeah.
So that is the second. So there's a time factor. And third is a mental distance. That is the most crucial. People in my, like I referred to in my book, my driver used to conversationally ask me, sir, in India, how are wedding ceremonies? In India, how are things? And I used to feel, and I used to feel very lonely at that time when he said that, because here I am, a young guy, 26, 27 years old, and I'm on my first posting, and this guy is asking me, in India, how are things? He was not saying it to irritate me. It was just very natural. It came very naturally. So they felt that we were aliens. And there was a word in Manipuri for alien, and it's called Mayang. And Mayang was not a complimentary term. It was a slightly derogatory term. We were all called Mayangs. And that same sentiment was returned by most people from India, who they will speak in, when they are even in the presence of Manipuris, they will talk about not very complimentary way about the local people and all. So, all this has created a mental distance. And that is what I think my DC was meaning when he said, on a clear day, you can see India.
Well, Balagopalji, so I think we will continue this conversation on people and places. The long and short of today's discussion that we have had on the focus discussion that we have had on Manipur is that, he had experienced, or at least his DC had talked about the huge physical and mental distances that are there between the national capital and India and Manipur. And what recent events are showing us is that, that distance is yet to be properly covered up, and that we have not been able to get through that distances and create a sense of amiability. But hopefully things will turn out to the better, with more and more knowledgeable people understanding, and with people in positions of power actually taking up the responsibility and taking up the dialogue forward. Thank you. Wait for another episode of People and Places in the next few days. Thank you.